there's a way in which I could return to, we need to talk about Kevin, which of course took on the school shooting phenomenon. Right now, adolescents are often getting caught up in gender identity issues. And my biggest reluctance to take on that material is just how depressing I would find it to be living with this stuff for 2 years, because I find this whole phenomenon deeply disturbing.
Now, since 2020, there has been this revolution, this cultural revolution. Well, it goes back a long time, but 2020 was really the peak year, the BLM year, the year of wokeness. Do you feel the tide has kind of receded since then when it comes to the cultural revolution in media, in novels, in TV and movies and stuff like that?
I like to think that we've turned a corner. I don't think this stuff is over. Trump not only has introduced a sea change in U.S. politics and culture, but it's also inspired a pushback. So, a movement, if you can call it that has been illiberal, authoritarian, heavy-handed, censorious, all is suddenly able to claim that those are the forces that it is fighting. And that's the bad news, because it makes the wokesters seem like the heroes and the saviors and the believers in free speech and fighting back against the authoritarianism of the Trump administration and all that he represents. And that's kind of handing them a win. I do think, though, that things are better. And most of all, I have this sense that it's more permissible, and less risky to stick your neck out on certain issues and just to air views. For example, most conspicuously, I think about the whole trans obsession. It was not that long ago that you took your career in your hands if you said the tiniest discouraging word about an obsession with pretending to change sex, which is it has to be one of the great bizarre aspects of the current ethos. And I'm really glad to see that, we are finally able to talk about the fact that this is absurd. And why are we doing this? And why are we cutting up little children? I mean, that's just better late than never.
Well, we just saw enshrined in law today in the UK Supreme Court that under the definition of the Equality Act, a woman is a biological woman. It's not a trans woman. So this seems to be a kind of landmark moment, if you like, perhaps in the culture wars.
Yeah, it shouldn't be as important as it is, but it is. It's really important. And it is the salvation of women's spaces in the UK. Because if legally a so-called trans woman is an actual woman, then women wouldn't have a leg to stand on. I mean, there would be no way to keep men out of women's prisons, out of women's changing rooms, etc. So, yeah, I'm greatly relieved. I'm usually an opponent of the existence of a UK Supreme Court, but finally it's redeemed its existence.
You've written about troubled young people in your most famous novel. Obviously, the kind of transgender movement or transgender pathology is very much a young person phenomenon. It's a lot of teenagers trying to figure out their gender identity and their sexual identity and so on. Is this something that you've thought about, that you've written about, in terms of how young people today are trying to deal with these issues, particularly with mental health and things like that?
I've certainly written about it in nonfiction in my Spectator column. I've made editors nervous by sticking my neck out a little before that threshold that I I described, we hadn't passed it yet, and it was extremely dangerous. I've thought about taking it on in fiction. I haven't decided. There's a way in which I could return to We Need to Talk About Kevin, which of course took on the school shooting phenomenon, and kind of revisit that material and update it, because right now adolescents are often getting caught up in gender identity issues. And my biggest reluctance to take on that material is just how depressing I would find it to be living with this stuff for 2 years. And I have to decide whether I can stomach that, because I find this whole phenomenon deeply disturbing. And I guess I would suggest that kids who are looking to what sex they are to sort out who they are looking in the wrong place. And I'm sympathetic with how hard it is to be a kid and a teenager and even a young adult. It's difficult to make the journey to being a grown-up. It's full of pitfalls, and you don't necessarily know who or what you are going to become. And that ambiguity, and which is also freedom, is frightening, and it is tempting to seize on things. But I would say this is a complete misunderstanding of what an identity is. That, when I was growing up and trying to decide who I was, we worried about our identity, as every generation has. But it wasn't a matter of what sex you were, which is kind of a given. It was, what music do you like? What books do you love? And maybe read over and over again, and become a part of you. What were your politics? That was important then also. It was a matter of taste and exploration and finding things outside yourself often, and other people outside of you, that gave you a context and a sense of attachment to the world, but a very particular one. You liked Simon and Garfunkel, but you weren't big on hard rock, like that kind of thing. That's having an identity, and one of the nice things about understanding and identity in that way is that it's a process that never stops. So you continue to refine who you are throughout your entire life. I'm still doing it. I'm still deciding who I am. I'm still adding, and I'm afraid also probably subtracting, because I'm getting old enough to forget everything. And that makes life interesting. You never arrive. You're never, I've actually done a whole essay on this concept of happiness, and saying that we tend to misconceive of it as a point of arrival, and instead it isn't. I don't want to sound hackneyed and soppy, but it is a journey. It is a matter of, it is a direction. It is a trajectory. It is doing something. It is getting somewhere. It is not about sitting on an island and piddling your feet in the oasis and feeling self-satisfied. It's so, and I actually think that's one of the reasons the trans thing is so attractive, is that it's one of those journeys, right? It gives you something to do. It gives you a trajectory, a point B to arrive at, and it's also a process that is impossible, so that you're not threatened with ever complacently arriving on your little tropical island, because you can't become the other sex. So it's an infinite process of trying to arrive at a point which which you cannot reach. And that means it's a project that lasts forever. The trouble is, it's a crummy project. It doesn't accomplish anything. It's basically meaningless. It's a theater. It's like deciding you want to be an actor, but you never get to be in the movies. You're just pretending to be someone you're not. To me, that's the absolute opposite of finding your identity, pretending to be something you're not. I mean, that's fake. It's about fakery. It's about, and it's all about appearance. There's a lot of talk about this deep inside gender identity, which is of course fraudulent also, but then it's just about surfaces. It's about trying to take people in, or at least bullying them into pretending that they buy your performance, which is even worse. I mean, but most of all, you accomplish absolutely nothing. We have enough men and women in the world. We don't have to keep swapping places. So in social terms, it's a tremendous waste of resources. In addition to which, the chances are you're going to create more problems than you solve, right? Medically, emotionally, psychically, it's just going to f you up. It's the wrong answer. Right? You should be asking the question. We all ask the question, who am I? I just showed up in this place. I don't have very long before I disappear again. I have to figure out how to spend my time. And in order to spend my time profitably, I have to have some understanding of myself, of what and how other people see me and how I feel, all that. That's one of the most fascinating things about being a temporarily alive person. But this is a regressive answer. And I say that politically as well as psychically and emotionally. It is going backwards. It is putting a huge emphasis on sex, and it's making it your whole self. And I don't care about being a woman. I really do not give a shit. I think that if I could have chosen, I might have preferred to be male, because I find being female physically inconvenient. It has more downsides, but I don't think it's vital to who I am. And I think I could be sort of the same person if I had been born male. And most of all, I just want to de-emphasize it, because I have close friends of both sexes, and I don't separate them in my head as these are my female friends and I especially like them. It's not like that. I like people. And I thought that's where we were going when I was growing up. And now we've gone backwards.
Well, one of the differences between when you were growing up and today is that young people have access to smartphones and the internet. And it seems, according to data, that young people are having less sex, they're doing fewer drugs, drinking less alcohol. They're more socially isolated, and they're obviously addicted to screens, to social media. And if you look at the rates of anxiety and depression amongst young people, it's skyrocketed, particularly amongst young women. And a lot of this trans phenomenon is actually among young autistic girls. It is heavily sort of biased towards them. So how do you think the internet is impacting young people today? I presume that you agree with people like Jonathan Haidt that it's having a negative impact. And you talk about transgenderism perhaps being a purpose for people's lives. You sound like, the way that you just said that answer, you sound like an atheist. You sound very secular. We're on this earth for a very short period of time and we have to figure out what we're doing. I suppose in a more Christian age, that question was already answered. So there's a few themes there, the internet and secularism, and how is that impacting young people today?
I think the internet, it has an ironic effect in that it makes people antisocial, as you described, because they're not dealing with real people very much, certainly not in person. but it also makes people hyper aware socially. And I think that the social media, the way it's set up, it encourages people to think about what other people think of them all the time. I think it makes you feel as if you're always being watched, always being judged, that you have to constantly curate your presentation to the world, it creates a sense of artifice, because you're not being genuine. You don't even know what genuine is if you've grown up with this stuff. So, you have to, present this tailored and made up persona, which is a different thing from a person. So that whole thing of feeling watched and judged all the time, it strikes me as an extremely unpleasant sensation. And one of the reasons that I enjoy writing novels is I don't feel watched. And I sometimes pay lip service to writing for an audience, and acknowledge my readership. But when I am writing a novel, I am not writing for a readership, and I do not feel watched. I just write for myself. I am entertaining myself. I'm telling a story. I'm going to try to do a really good job of it, partly because that makes it more fun, and also because it is an occupation, and I have to make a living, and part of the process is eventually publishing it, and then, of course, subjecting myself to other people's opinions of what I have done. But that's not my favorite part. That is in some ways the most unpleasant part. Now, and even when I get a good reception for a book, good reviews, not that anybody reads those anymore, or people, saying on Amazon and Goodreads, this is great, and, keeping a four-star rating, which is as good as you're ever going to get. That's, to me, mostly about not being criticized, if you know what I mean. It's like, whew, right? Rather than make me all swell up like a tick, I just feel like I got out of being destroyed. So it's still a fearful process, and I am sorry for people who are basically, they're living in the post-publication world, if I can put it in terms of my own profession, which means that you're in a state of anxiety. That's what it is. It's like I am very worried. Whenever I'm going to encounter any reaction to me, I'm worried it's going to be negative. I'm scared of people saying mean things about me. I mean, honestly, that's one of the main reasons I'm not on social media. I will be honest about it. I don't want people to be able to tell me mean things about me. And I most enjoy publication is a one-way process, right? I write something, I put it out there, and I don't hear about it, right? I just move on to the next thing. I've got something else to write. That's my ideal professional life. I don't want to hear what you think. Every once in a while, there's an exception. I mean, I did a couple pieces for The Spectator in which I explained a cascade of health crises, which explained why I disappeared from the magazine for a couple of months. And I did, after my sister-in-law urged me to, read the comments after those columns. And I was really touched. And they were just 100% nice. And I was glad I got the feedback. But that's it. That was the exception. And by and large, I have a rule not to read the comments after my columns not to read the reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. The only reviews I ever read are the kind of legacy media ones. Sometimes I think I should not have read those either. But that's just a kind of lifetime habit. If I were a real purist, I wouldn't read those either.
I want to talk about some of the recent media that has come out. I don't know if you've watched what kind of shows that you watch or whether you consume this stuff, but adolescence obviously was huge.
I watch appalling amounts of TV.
Okay,
Like
good.
everyone.
That's good for this question then. You can talk about whatever show you like, but I can give you a few examples of recent things that are very popular. So adolescence in the UK, that caused a huge political stir on both sides. White Lotus obviously has been going, that's on HBO. They've been making this show about very rich people in this sort of hotel chain, and there's murders, and it's quite an interesting conceit. But there's also lots of other things I'm sure that you've watched. Maybe can you comment on just the politics of that and sort of how these shows have adapted to cultural trends in recent years?
Well, I haven't seen the latest White Lotus. I'm looking forward to it. It's an access issue. But I have seen the first two seasons, and I found that show very encouraging on a political level. And that, of course, was before Trump. But it was making fun of progressive vanity, right? Progressive political vanity. And so it wasn't just rich people, it was often rich liberal people. And they do make easy pickings. I know myself, I do the same thing. So yeah, I thought I hope that the third season keeps it up.
It does.
It does. Oh, great! I have something to look forward to.
It's very good. Yeah.
And I did see Adolescence. I wasn't bowled over in the same way that everyone seems to have been. I thought the ending was weird. I mean, just watching the father weep for 15 minutes. I thought they could have done a little better. A little crying in drama goes a long way. I haven't taught a lot of creative writing, but one of the few bits of advice that I've dished out is, keep the crying and hysterical laughing to a minimum. And I wouldn't diss that show. It's got some very good acting. What I would diss a little bit is the reaction to it, the over-the-top enthusiasm. If the 13-year-old had been black, I hate to say it, but nobody would have watched it, right? The white audience wouldn't have watched it. It wouldn't have seemed to pertain to them, and they wouldn't have even found the central story shocking, which is shocking, right? And I just think it was a little too easy. There aren't very many villains you can go for these days. But the whole Andrew Tate minority, this little fringy, hyper masculine, arguably misogynistic cult. Who's for that? So it's just very safe, right? It's a white kid, so you don't get into the whole race thing, and of course one of the detectives is black, and he's the hero, and the toxic masculinity is really what we're talking about. I mean, that trite concept. And I think that's I mean, I can see why the script writers went for that. It was certainly a popular choice. Witness the reaction, but it's I mean, for example, he's not trans, is he? Right? That would be really scary, dangerous. So it's I don't think that show quite deserves the kind of acclaim it has received, and I don't think it's a good idea to show it in schools, because it's once again, demonizing white boys, and they have a hard enough time.
Just on the trans thing, because there was a transgender school shooter in Nashville. Have you looked into that? Are you kind of interested in that angle when you said you're thinking about writing maybe a novel along the transgender lines? Is that that maybe sort of links in with your previous book?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I just watched is it Winston Marshall, who has a podcast, and he just interviewed Andy No on this strange phenomenon of trans people in the Antifa movement, which is very violent and amoral, and these people have been guilty of a number of murders. And Andy No had found that the element of transgenderism being highly overrepresented statistically among these people is massively ignored or buried in the legacy media accounts in the rare instance that this phenomenon is even covered. So yeah, I mean, maybe you're giving me ideas.
One last question now. I know that you've previously lived in the States and obviously in Britain. You spent a lot of time in Britain. I don't know if you're happy to say where you are, but I know that you're not in Britain anymore, at least not permanently. Can you talk about perhaps why you no longer want to live in the UK? Is it because of kind of the decline of the UK and sort of multiculturalism, that sort of thing, or is there another reason?
Oh, it's complex. I mean, there's some of it is positive. It's not a big secret that I moved to Portugal, though I pop back to the UK with some frequency. On the positive, we have friends here. My husband has been, he's a jazz musician. He's been playing here for years, so he has colleagues here. We were at the point in our lives that if we're going to make a big change, we had better get around to it, because otherwise we would just keep doing what we'd been doing. And lots of people in their 60s would recognize that, because it's when people make one last big move, and if you don't do it while you're still relatively healthy and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, then you're never going to do it. So that was part of it. But yeah, I mean, I started finding the UK depressing. I did, and I am disheartened by the way in which Britain has taken on the worst qualities of contemporary America. That did not, rather than say, we're not going to go down that route, just copied all the woke stuff, top to bottom. If anything, indulging it even more insanely, certainly because there's things you can't do with the First Amendment in the United States, whereas here, I compulsively say here, that's how long I was in the UK. In the UK, with no First Amendment, then we're throwing people in prison for saying something slightly unpleasant online. I mean, it's disheartening, and I don't like being surrounded by that kind of cultural self-hatred, the lack of pride. Honestly, I think the immigration rate is indicative of a lack of pride. I mean, there's no intention to protect British culture, what it means to be British. So you just dilute yourself with tons of other people from anywhere, and you can, until you're just like a patch in a map, and what and who you are, it's meaningless. It's just a kind of montage. And yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that I left the UK because the immigration rate was too high, but it was an ingredient of many of signs of just loss of a sense of self. And everything we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation to do with identity also pertains to cultures. And the British culture is looking in the wrong place for its identity. In other words, diversity is its identity. That's the new point of pride, that you have tons of people from everywhere, and they're not British in any original sense of the word, and that's what has been embraced at the top. That's it. That's kind of that is all there is, and it's not a very good answer to having an identity. It's basically like we're like everybody, and that's not an identity. That defies the meaning of the word. So I just I've started finding Britain a dark place, and I was also living in London and surrounded by people who are having a hard time affording anything. I mean, it's just there, and then the feeling. I hope it changes, but the feeling is that not only are things bad now, but they're going to be worse later, and that's a gross atmosphere to live in, and I don't miss it.